Thanks for watching and listening to this podcast. Remember, this conversation shouldn't be and isn't limited to just the three of us on the screen. We want to hear your views. Please share your comments with us below, like the page and share. Thank you. Well, welcome to this podcast once again with me, Mabon ap Gwynfor, and Liz Saville-Roberts. And joining us today is Lowri Cunnington Wynn over in Llanfrothen. How are you, Lowri? Are you okay?
I'm well, thank you very much, yes.
Good. And Liz, how are you? Okay?
Very well, thank you.
Well, we'll be looking later on at the idea of community and how people feel within the community, and also the movement of people within and without of communities. But before we look at that subject matter in depth, Liz, we've had a pretty heavy week and an important week over in Westminster. You've been over there once again representing the people of Dwyfor Meirionnydd. Can you just give us a brief update on how things are going there?
Okay, well, of course, what we've had this week was the financial statement from the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak. And I mean, there are aspects of it that even obviously from a different party that I would welcome, those particularly to do with supporting young people back into work. And also the reduction of VAT on tourism and hospitality, which is something that Plaid Cymru has been calling for over 10 years. It's been reduced temporarily to 5%. But the other hand, I think, particularly looking at what an area like Dwyfor Meirionnydd and also Wales as a whole, been very, very dependent on the furlough scheme. And I think we talk about something like 74% of businesses have made use of that in Wales. We're still seeing that that's beginning to come to an end and will come to an end finally in October. I would also really have liked to see some more support for the self-employed as well, because that's a sort of concern that they're now really being left to cope as best they can. And one of the things this week, and it was a real pleasure now that the local travel rule has been lifted. I was allowed to stop off in Bala when I drove back from London, and it was great. It really was fantastic to see people again. It made me, I don't think I've ever been so irrationally happy to be in Bala before, and it was great to see other people. But the one message that I got across, and I think this is relevant to Rishi Sunak's announcement as well, is that people are still very, very anxious about what the health impact could be in the future. They do fear local outbreaks or a second wave. And what I would have liked to have seen, and I think we'll still keep the pressure on the Treasury as well, is look, if there are local outbreaks, if you really want to get people's confidence to get them to go out for a meal and go out shopping, if you really want to give people confidence, you need to be able to show that the Westminster government and the Welsh government can manage any local outbreaks again, because that's the one thing that I think that will really give people confidence.
Yeah, and confidence is so important. We need confidence in those decision makers and those in power, that we think that they're taking the right decisions on our behalf. And so far, I don't think we can say we've got much confidence in the Westminster government, at least in how they dealt with this pandemic.
I mean, just to list a few negative points, we know that the track and trace app isn't up and running. We also know that the percentage of people who respond to the call for self-isolate is actually really quite low. These are the things that only central government can manage. Now, the kickstart for now is good, but to really get people's confidence up, we have to be able to manage the health question.
And the coronavirus, the pandemic, it's had an impact on every community, not least here in Dwyfor Meirionnydd. And Lowri, you're in Llanfrothen. How have you responded in Llanfrothen? How's the community there reacted to the pandemic?
It's actually reacted and responded really very well. So we have a local shop called Siop Hegin y Garreg, which is run by my partner and his brothers. So they've been very, very busy and were sort of ahead of the game, really. They shut down the shop quicker than any of the other local shops. So it was a closed shop for a while, and they were taking orders over the phone and then delivering boxes to members of the community who were shielding and older members of the community, because we have quite a lot of them. So they've been really, really very busy throughout the whole of this. And sort of, listening to the community, what they need, what the needs of those communities are, what the community is, and that's been really, really important. They've been working really, really hard, and it actually would have been easier for them to shut shop in times financially, but they decided against doing that. It would have been much cheaper for them had they done that, and they're really glad they haven't, and everyone in the community is really glad they haven't. But that it was touch and go for a while, definitely.
So there's a strong community spirit in Llanfrothen. And the way that they've pulled together the last number of months.
Definitely a very strong community spirit. I would reiterate that really, and I have felt very fortunate to live in such a community actually, because of, I'm sorry, you can hear quite a lot of screaming.
In my house here, don't worry about it.
Fine. I felt very fortunate to live in such a beautiful place, having access to the outdoors, and I have definitely felt my privilege actually. And we've often felt like millionaires when the weather is beautiful and we're just able to chuck the children outside, so we've felt very, very fortunate, and the community spirit's been a part of that.
Well, that does bring us on to the subject matter, feeling a part of the community. What is the community? How do you get to be a part of the community, especially if you've moved in to an area from elsewhere? You've looked at this in depth. I know someone you've referred to in your paper in the past has said that people are migrating from rural Welsh Wales to more urban conurbations, maybe in South Wales or in England, because of economic factors, specifically lack of jobs here. And that's been an argument that's been put forward. But you've delved deeper into this and seen that it's not necessarily just the economy that's driving young people away from the communities. Could you elaborate a little bit on the work that you've done and how you've come to that conclusion?
Yeah, so the work was based on a PhD which was funded by the Welsh Language Board as it was then, and it was based on a figure or data which said that young people who were not born in Wales left Wales at a rate 4 times higher than people who were born here. So not that they hadn't learned the language, because they certainly had learned the language, and they looked as though, or seemed as though they were fully integrated into these communities, but actually they were leaving. So they were taking their qualifications with them and their experiences, and that was, really quite sad. And we wanted to see what the experiences of these young people were. So when I started the questionnaires and started the focus groups and the interviews, we were expecting to find that these young people left because of the lack of economy. And that's what they seemed to say to begin with. Oh, there's no jobs, the job that I want to do isn't available here, or, I'm not able to do it in rural Wales, so I'm leaving. But as we delved a little bit deeper, there was more to it than that. They felt like they didn't fully integrate or fully belong to that community. They didn't feel like they were Welsh enough, that they belonged to those communities. And the case studies that I used were Blaenau Ffestiniog and Tregaron, so Ceredigion and Gwynedd. And this was especially marked in Tregaron, where you have a very old Welsh farming community, and being Welsh meant that you were a part of this old farming community, this ancient farming community, really. And so those young people moving in felt that they never belonged to that. Their parents didn't belong to it, and so therefore they didn't belong to it. And they didn't have those same ties, and were like, well, this isn't for me, this isn't my community. And that was very, very true. Blaenau is very post-industrial. It's a fairly new town, which means that perhaps they're used to these influxes of people, migration, out-migration, and therefore are able to sort of cope with it a little bit more. Perhaps no one feels like they belong in Blaenau Ffestiniog, those sorts of ideas. But yeah, so that was definitely true of Tregaron, and it did pose questions of, okay, what is community, what is belonging? Is the Welsh language isn't a passport to belonging in a community, and it doesn't necessarily mean that those Welsh speakers that we raise are going to stay here.
That is an interesting point. Liz, when I look at you, I see you as a person from Nevin. I consider you as someone who belongs to Nevin. You've been a councillor there, you're a member of parliament for this area, but that's not necessarily your experience originally. You've come from London originally. Can you empathise with some of what Lowri is discussing there?
I think Nevin now.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, because I'm originally from southeast London, and I lived in a place called Eltham, went to school in Blackheath, and I was there till I was 18. But I made the conscious choice at that age that I wanted to go to Aberystwyth to learn Welsh and Irish, which I didn't speak at all before I went to university there. I thought a lot about what belonging to different communities means to me, and also what it means to be from these mixed backgrounds within communities here, and how community as a whole thinks about that. Now, one of the things that I certainly found myself, and I'm very conscious of this from very early on, was the real gain for me personally when I started to learn Welsh, and gradually people accepted that I could speak Welsh. Interestingly, what I've always had, wherever I am in Wales, people think that I'm a Welsh language speaker, first language speaker, but that I'm from somewhere else. So I get away with this sort of mongrel. You know, I could be from Ceredigion or I could be from Ynys Môn, depending on where. I get away with this sort of mongrel mid by Ceredigion sort of accent. But it means that I'm not actually from anywhere locally. But the sense of comparing the sense of belonging that I have gained as an individual from having learnt Welsh to what I had was in South East London, that has been one of the major motivators of my life, is that sense that I gained so much more from learning Welsh specifically. Now, alongside that, then my identity, for myself, is at the one hand, I have this access to the most resourced language in the world. I think that is fair to say with English. It's not largest in terms of speakers, but it is the most resourced language in the world. I've had that, which gives me many opportunities, but being a speaker of Welsh as well, that has made me as an individual be acting within communities to which I can contribute far more. It's given me as an individual a sense of an intrinsic value, which being a member of solely of the English speaking world, I would never have. I would be a tiny, 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 tiny unit in this huge English speaking universe. Whereas in Wales, my role as an individual can really make a difference. And that is so, so rewarding. And this is one of the things I think, if we could move on to how we consider people who are from Welsh or English backgrounds, because we know this is considered, how we can consider that within a place like Gwynedd. Now, the language charter was one of the first steps, I think, to go beyond looking at what Gwynedd has really succeeded in doing, which is using Welsh as a medium of education, but looking at it rather than what this education system sort of gives to the individual, does to the individual within education, what actually you need to do to support somebody to consider themselves as being a Welsh speaker. Because you may be a Welsh speaker at school, but not outside. And that's not just the individual, it's the community as a whole, all around them. And I think how we move on to that in the future. And I would actually go so far as to be a little bit controversial. I think that we should be looking at our success factor, particularly those sorts of young people who actually may be leaving Gwynedd because they don't get a sense of identity from being here, much as I left London. And an education system or a community as a whole, which doesn't consider how it's giving that identity to all its young people, needs to think again, possibly.
Lowri, that's true, isn't it? Your paper and your work has looked at those issues raised by Liz there, and how societies maybe within our community welcome or ostracize individuals that come in. One fascinating thing that I read in your work was how the parents' experience influenced the new generation. That's what Liz has said there. There's no debating that, is there?
No, I mean, basically, and often we parrot the experiences of our parents, whether we like it or not, and whether we're conscious of it or not. And if their parents had the negative experience of living in Wales or the Welsh language, then they weren't gonna, their starting block, their sort of base was, well, my mum and dad have had the bad experience of this, a negative experience, and that has rubbed off on me, and that was definitely clear to say, and in a way, we can't hide that, we sort of expected that. Where it's difficult is where you have, schools, for example, who are often the centre or that language centre for those young people, especially in places like Tregaron, where they are already creating different camps within the school itself, and they then carry on into the community. So you have an English stream and you have a Welsh stream, partly because of resource, because putting them in together might not be practical. So there is a resource issue there, but that bringing them in together means that that separating them, means that those separations carry on then into the community. And that wasn't actually happening in Ysgol y Moelwyn at the time either. They were all in together.
So those community experiences are so vitally important in how not just they are treated in school, but how the community at large treats people who move in to live in the area.
Yeah.
I know Jessica Davis on Twitter recently said she was born and bred in Aberystwyth, but to English parents, I think. But she said that when she was back in Wales, she now lives in Cardiff, I think, people said, well, you're not really Welsh, are you? Because of her parents' background. But when she went to her grandparents or family in England, people said, well, you're not really English, are you? And she was sort of lost and felt lost in her identity. And I think that question around identity, there's nothing stopping us having multiple identities, isn't there? You know, if we look at the Nordic countries, you know, they can be Scandinavian and Norwegian, what have you. And we all have these multiple identities, don't we, Liz?
Yeah, and these are all, again, there's sort of, you get some people who are concerned about bilingual education who somehow think that one language will squash another language out. No, it doesn't. This is all a game. Even the way that you view the world, the different ways that you describe something, the ways that you can deal with people in different terms. One of my pages, I always find that when I start talking Welsh, it feels much closer to individuals. And you get that moment when you've been mistakenly speaking English to people because you didn't realize they spoke Welsh, and you switch and you can feel the emotional change when it happens. So it's actually, for us all, it's an additive process. It's not a matter of being just solely English speaking or just solely Welsh speaking, but all these things add to what the individual gains. And just to come back, I think that the positiveness of this experience, come back to very briefly from my point of view, just to say with education, what worries me about our dependence on education, is to look back from the Irish experience as well with that, is that there are some young people who are just associating using Welsh with being corrected all the time, never being quite good enough. They're only using Welsh with the teacher. It's safe to say, because I'm an ex-teacher, that teachers are not real people, and that as a young person, you want to go and talk to other people. So it's to come back as, what do we count as our successes? Not what we can manage within the institution of the school and the academic use of language, but to what degree are those young people using Welsh with each other, with real people outside? Those are the things that we need to look at as the markers of success in transferring the language into use outside school.
In order for that to happen, we have to have those, we have to have a community, and things that have, issues such as austerity are breaking down those communities. So things like community groups are breaking down. We don't have services in the same way. So leisure services, for example, libraries, swimming pools, gyms, whatever, that those things are slowly being chipped away at. And as soon as you chip away too much of that, you don't have a community to sustain that language either. And there's something also to be said for school closures, whatever that may be. You start closing schools, you start and there are definitely resource issues for that as well, but once you start chipping away at those building blocks of a community, how are you going to sustain a language without a community as well?
But then what we're doing today is actually quite an interesting challenge, because we are talking together in a way which we might not have talked before. One of these we need to do is to embrace the technology. And make sure that actually is one of the new ways that we're forming communities, which is happening with the chapel societies as well as we speak, of course.
So one takeaway for me from this conversation is that it's not solely down to the goodwill of individuals and that we expect them to learn, or the goodwill just of the community to embrace people, but it's also down to political leaders, government, to ensure that policies are in place to maintain the physical infrastructure of community, the connection between communities, and ensure that things are in place to allow that community to be healthy and thrive and grow. Would that be a fair assessment, Lowri?
I would say yes. It needs a whole host of factors. It can't be one thing. We can't say that we're going to create, a million Welsh speakers by 2050 without all those things in together. We need massive community support. We need to be able to support those Welsh speakers and their families, or those young people who weren't born in Wales and their families. And there needs to be a concerted effort from the whole of community with that, to do with, the schools, the councils, everyone, community groups. That it has to be a joint effort for sure.
And Liz, we're fortunate here in Dwyfor Meirionnydd that there is a lot of that goodwill already there within our communities, within people living here.
And I think the point that Lowri made too, and this is something that comes back to central government and our expectations of central government. We've been told that austerity was something that we needed. that has undercut much of the props that uphold a civilized, functioning society. However wealthy you are, however little money you don't want to give into the taxation system, do we really want a society that isn't healthy, that isn't educated, that doesn't have decent roads, that doesn't look after its elderly people? What do we actually want out of society? And now at this time, of course, we've been clapping for care and health workers, for all the key workers. Now we really need to get that underpinned into our political system, that these people aren't an optional extra, that if you want a civilized, safe, healthy, happy, flourishing society, that needs the structures about it to keep in place. It won't happen through the open market, and it won't happen through trickle-down economics.
We're reaching the end of this conversation, unfortunately. We could go on for so long, but I think that's a good point to end it on there. Lowri, diolch yn fawr iawn I ti. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very
sharing
much.
your expertise. You know, let's hope we can carry on with this discussion. Liz, diolch unwaith eto. Thank you once again for the work that you're doing.
Diolch yn fawr.